There we go. All right, so thank you, everybody. My name is Kylie Briggs. I'm the Northeast Turtle Conservation Coordinator for the Riparian Society. We focus on restoring critical habitat for rare reptiles and amphibians. And I want to talk to you today about a species that I've been working with for the past few years in eastern Vermont, and how you might be able to fold conservation for this species into riparian conservation projects. So I'm, of course, talking about wood turtles. And I understand even people that work in wood turtle habitat often haven't had the chance to see one of these animals. So I want to tell you a little bit of information about them before we get into the buffer specifics. So first, I'm talking about a medium-sized turtle. They get up to about 8 inches in length. They have brown shells that form these really unique concentric rings around each of the scales or scutes of their shell that give them this appearance almost as if they've been carved out of wood, which is where their name comes from. They have a black head, but then most of the rest of their skin is orange, although males can be fairly dark and have a lot of black in there as well. If you flip them over, their belly, called a plastron, is yellow with dark blotches. And while most of their shells are kind of this brown coloration, on rare occasions you find them with these brilliant yellow stripes or yellow spots all over the shell. This is one of the more brilliantly colored turtles that I've seen. And just in a nutshell, I'll tell you that this is a species that is rare pretty much everywhere they occur. In Vermont, they're widespread, but occur in low numbers all over the place. So what I would tell most people is that you could see a wood turtle almost anywhere in the state, but you really expect not to. They overwinter in streams, and what really sets them apart from any other turtle that we have in Vermont is that even though they are aquatic in the winter, they're mostly terrestrial during the summer, and they forage extensively on land, especially in riparian habitat, and typically stay within about 1,000 feet of their rivers, but they can travel much farther away from water than that. And even though water quality is very important to them, especially dissolved oxygen levels, in the winter, by far the greatest threats they encounter while they are on land. So really, this is a riparian habitat specialist, and if I could design about an acre of habitat for them, it might look something like this. We have a clear bubbling brook flowing through the middle of this photo. There's a floodplain on one or both sides of the river. This particular floodplain is dominated by sort of like an open mixed boreal forest. It doesn't have to be like that. Wood turtles are not very picky about what the land habitat looks like. The stream itself has a lot of structures. There's a blown out beaver dam, some logs falling across the river. These are all giving the turtles places to hide during the winter. There's a shallow pool under the beaver dam. They might overwinter at the bottom of that pool. And one of the most important features here are the sand and gravel bars. Wood turtles don't like to travel very far from water to lay their eggs. They'd rather just lay their eggs right on the banks of the river and then head farther away later on in the summer. This is another example of wood turtle habitat. So here we have, again, there's a floodplain. You can't see the river, but it's in there. And that floodplain wetland is surrounded by rolling hills with mixed hardwood forests and hay fields. There isn't a square foot in this photo that wouldn't be used by a wood turtle population. And the streams themselves, if I'm looking for a good wood turtle stream, I'll use aerial imagery and look for these streams that have lots of twists and turns. Those meandering rivers, the twists and turns, just facilitate the creation of those sandbars where the turtles are going to nest and are a good indicator that you've got a decent floodplain in there. And I throw this picture in there just to reiterate that this is a clean water species. You might find a wood turtle in a more murky river on occasion, but you tend to see them in much lower numbers. Every good wood turtle population I'm aware of is in a water with pretty much in a river with crystal clear water. Now, even in the few places in Vermont where wood turtles might be common, people tend not to see them. And a major reason for that is that they hide pretty much all of the time. So while you might see a painted turtle basking on a log from several hundred feet away, this is what it looks like when a wood turtle basks. What you see here is right in the middle of this photo, there's a muddy turtle butt sticking out of some vegetation. It's receiving filtered sunlight through the branches and debris. But if you're just walking along the banks of this river, unless you're looking specifically for wood turtles and know where they hide and have a good search image, your odds of seeing these animals are very, very low, unless you happen to catch them between point A and point B when they might be exposed. This is another example of a wood turtle hiding spot. So I learned at this particular spot that if I want to find the turtles, I should just walk from snag to snag and start poking around the vines and debris around the edges of those snags, because there are actually turtles hiding in there. But if I just went for a walk in that floodplain, even if I had a curious dog, I would not be seeing wood turtles. And that just happens to be one of the best spots in the state for them. Something that's kind of handy for these turtles is they develop growth rings on their shell, at least while they're growing, which is about the first 20 years of their life. If you count these rings, you can figure out within a year or two how old they are. This one happens to be on its 7th year. But after they stop growing, their shells start to wear down and you lose those growth rings. So you can estimate their age at this point just by trying to get a handle on the amount of wear and tear that they have. And we don't really know exactly how long they can live in the wild, but what we do know is that for their shells to become this worn down, that should take about 70 years. And we have credible evidence to suggest that they probably live into their 90s, perhaps even in excess of 100 years. And their nesting habitat. So I mentioned they're just trying to lay their eggs on sand and gravel bars on the banks of the river. Spots with a lot of wood turtles. If you visit them in late May through early July, you might see a lot of turtle tracks across the sand. And really the most important thing here is that the sandbars are high enough above the water that they're protected from your typical summer flood. But what happens in a lot of cases where you have Japanese knotweed, in some rivers, the knotweed is very good at colonizing and staying on those sandbars, which can remove nesting habitat from wood turtles and force females to travel farther from the water to lay their eggs, putting them at greater risk and also resulting in their young having a much more difficult time getting to the rivers. And where they actually overwinter in the water, they're kind of flexible. They might overwinter on the bottom of a pool, but to get even more protection from the current and from predators, they're more likely going to wedge themselves into an undercut bank or into some exposed roots. So that gets us through just the basic ecology of wood turtles. I'm going to shift to threats and solutions. And while there's a lot of stuff I could talk about, I'm going to keep it to buffer-related topics. So this is a good example of what I consider former wood turtle habitat. You've got the river, there's a nice floodplain on both sides, but what's in that floodplain, what's in most floodplains, ag fields and a major road. These are the best places for farming and easiest places to build roads, so that's where these features are. But because wood turtles spend so much time on land and forage on land in those floodplains, that puts them in the path of tractors and crossing this major highway multiple times throughout the year. And the biggest threat to these turtles is that they're getting crushed by cars, ATVs, and getting mowed by tractors. So their populations are very sensitive to anything that kills adults. We know from demographic studies that only losing 2 turtles per year to human causes in most areas can cause localized extinction within 75 years. And these are the first 2 wood turtles that I found in my hometown, about a month apart from each other. And this area doesn't even have great habitat for wood turtles. So that was 2 in a month. And from a population that probably can't even handle the loss of 2 per year. This lady is one that I tracked with radio telemetry last year. She was grazed by a mower. This injury, I think, is superficial. She just had her shoulder blade resurfaced a little bit. She'll probably be fine. It's very common to find these turtles with pretty significant scars on their shells or even missing legs. Now, a typical river valley floodplain in eastern Vermont might look something like this, where the floodplain itself is pretty much entirely in agriculture. And this yellow buffer around it represents a 300-foot buffer. And 300 feet is what's recommended as an ideal buffer width for wood turtles. And I know that number is just ridiculously large. It's very difficult to get a 300-foot buffer, but that's where the wood turtles are going to spend most of their time. And if you're looking at or considering a site that has a significant population of wood turtles, that buffer recommendation is extended out to 1,000 feet. But because 300 feet is so difficult to accomplish, 1,000 is almost sort of a moot point. But the important thing here is that any buffer is better than no buffer, and the wider you can get that buffer, the better it's going to be for wood turtles. And wood turtles are a very good justification for expanding buffers beyond what you would normally consider purely for water quality purposes. Now, there's some wiggle room in here. When I say buffer, I don't necessarily mean it has to be a planted buffer. The most important thing to wood turtles in these buffers is that they're protected from cars, tractors, and ATVs. But you can do, even if you have a 300-foot buffer, or wider or less. You can do some management within that buffer. Maybe there's an objective to keep the habitat open, either for habitat or scenic purposes, or for other reasons. And you can do that through brush hogging. You can even do logging in that 300-foot zone. But ideally, that would all be done during the winter, so after November 1st or before March 1st, when the wood turtles are just not on land. You can do anything you want in that floodplain when the turtles are in the river, and they're not going to be affected by it unless water quality is sacrificed. And this infographic is just sort of a way to visualize that. So really April through October is when these turtles are on land, maybe even a little bit later for Vermont. I typically see wood turtles emerging between mid-April and early May here. So this is just a real life example of a site where I did some radio telemetry for wood turtles, and each color dot is a different specific turtle. And what you see is the 300-foot zone and the 1,000-foot zone. And the point here is that the vast majority of the time these turtles spend is in that 300-foot zone, but then about half of the turtles venture out into the 1,000-foot zone and spend a lot of time out there, and some even travel a little farther than that. So just looking at a real life example of a hypothetical wood turtle river. So we've got the two different buffer zones, but where are the wood turtles actually going to be in that zone? They don't tend to go out into the middle of fields. Instead, they'll use the edges. So where the wood turtles spend most of their time will be the entire forested or buffered habitat. And I'm kind of making this number up, but let's call it a 50-foot boundary or ecotone or just edge of that field, outside of the actual planted buffer. So it's that zone that's kind of the strike zone where most of the turtles are going to get hit by machinery. And there are a couple things you can do to work to solve that. First, if you can actually maintain open habitat along the edge of the field through late season mowing. So say, I'm kind of making this word up, but I'll call it a 50-foot pseudo buffer. That's just a brush hog after November 1st to maintain a field edge that isn't actually mowed while the turtles are present. That would be really beneficial. Or in cases where you can actually accomplish a really wide buffer, say it is 300 feet or maybe less, maybe more, if you can maintain some open habitat within that buffer, either through late season management, brush hogging, or some other sort of management, that would give the turtles that open early successional habitat, outside of the fields. They wouldn't be as motivated to leave their protected zone. And just some other basic buffer considerations that you can think about when you're working on things like knotweed control. That can be a species that's almost impossible to eradicate, especially from larger properties. But if you target knotweed control to sand and gravel bars, that at least will restore the wood turtle nesting habitat and be a huge help to them. When you're removing invasive shrubs like honeysuckle or buckthorn, it's very helpful, to leave that material behind. Don't chip it or take it out. Either just leave it standing or cut it down and leave the branches in piles. The reason for that is it's going to take several years or more for the native shrubs that you're planting to establish and replace that structure that the turtles use to hide in during the spring. So if you leave the dead invasive species behind, that at least gives the turtles a place to hide for a few years while your natives actually take time to establish. And again, I just need to reiterate that the most important thing here is keeping or minimizing cars, ATVs, and heavy machinery, the use of those things in that 300-foot zone while the turtles are active between March 31st and November 1st. And this is a little off topic, but I have to say this in every presentation because it's so important. There's an international black market for wood turtles. So if you're working on a property and trying to restore habitat for wood turtles, it's very important not to advertise specific locations to large audiences, and especially the internet. I personally have been contacted by dealers from Hong Kong asking me what my price list is for these turtles. And a lot of the people that poach these animals on a regular basis are looking for locations on the internet. So a good level would not be to name a specific stream or town or property, but you could say things like mention wood turtle conservation efforts on the county level or Huck 8 level. There's certain large systems that I wouldn't be concerned about. Like you could say you're doing wood turtle conservation in the Lake Memphremagog watershed or the Upper Connecticut River Valley, or even like the Otter Creek watershed. And those are vast areas. Good luck poachers figuring that out. But if you name a smaller stream or target area, that can really do irreversible harm to the turtles. So I'll leave that leave you guys with this picture. This is a wood turtle that I've seen many times over the last few years, and you may notice that he is missing his front left leg. It's really remarkable to me to see what these turtles are capable of surviving. I've even seen turtles that had no front legs and were capable of surviving in the river perfectly fine somehow. You see them really awful scars on their shells. It's just remarkable what they're able to endure and survive, but what they haven't managed to cope with are the changes we've made to the landscape and new threats, especially cars, tractors, and ATVs. So anything we can do to reduce risk to these turtles while they're out in those floodplains is going to be a huge help. And with that, I'll just remind everybody that if you haven't done so already, go ahead and purchase a conservation plate for your vehicle. Money that goes into that program directly funds conservation efforts for species like wood turtles. And if you have a property that you think might be good for wood turtles that you're working and you want to know either whether or not it's actually a good spot for wood turtles, is the habitat okay, or how can you better incorporate wood turtles into your management plan, I'm always available to answer questions, and I'm happy to work with you on that. So I'll leave things there and open things up to questions if we have time.
Thank you so much, Kylie. That was really interesting. I didn't know a ton about wood turtles before, and
nobody does
a lot. I was remarking to my partner who's in the house. I was like, "Did you know?" while you were speaking. So that's really cool. So there are a bunch of questions for you in the chat. I'm not sure if we'll have time to get to all of them, but we'll just start from the top and do a couple, and then maybe you can answer the others in the chat afterward. So one from Fritz, he was wondering if there's an optimal size range for rivers and streams used by wood turtles.
Definitely. So you tend not to find them really low in the watershed. So I'm thinking of like Champlain Valley. I wouldn't find them in like Otter Creek, close to Lake Champlain. The issue is just that those larger rivers develop all of the water quality issues of all of the tributaries that feed into them, and also have much stronger flood surges in the spring. And I think the floods are the big limiting factor. And the general rule of thumb that I like to use is a wood turtle stream. Your average adult should be able to throw a rock across it, but your average toddler should not be able to throw a rock across it. So that's kind of a subjective, but it's like the way that I think about it. Smaller than that or bigger than that, you could have wood turtles, but your odds of having a big population are pretty small.
Great, and then I think we'll do one more, and then if you don't mind looking at the chat and answering those,
certainly.
in a moment, that'd be sweet. So the next question from Meg Carter, she asked, does the Riparian Society have access to funding sources for Japanese knotweed control on sandbars, specifically for promoting wood turtle nesting habitat?
Yeah, so right now we don't have funding ourselves to do the knotweed control. The model that I've used for conservation is to identify landowners and properties in areas that are really important for wood turtles, so the places that are most critical to the populations, and then work with those landowners to figure out what other existing conservation program in the state might be a good match for them, be that NRCS, Fish and Wildlife Partners Program, other locally available options. And as I move forward, I do hope to have funding to do that ourselves. But at this point, it's been very effective just, referring these landowners to other conservation programs that have wood turtles listed as a priority for management, but don't necessarily know where it makes sense to target those efforts.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kylie.
You're welcome.
And yeah, like I said, lots of questions for you in the chat.
Yeah, I'll head to the chat right now.
Awesome. Okay, great. So next up we have Mark Labar, and he'll be talking about riparian buffer management for birds. Take it away, Mark. Mark, if you're talking to me, you're muted.
All right. Can folks hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hi, my name is Mark Labar. I'm Conservation Program Manager for Audubon, Vermont. And I'm going to talk today about birds, which I like a lot, and shrubs, which I like a lot, because many of the birds that I'm working with and that Audubon works with are shrub-dependent species. You can see a bunch of them here that we might find in a riparian habitat adjacent to, say, an old ag setting. One of the focal species we're working on is golden-winged warblers up there in the left-hand corner. American woodcock.
We can't see your slides.
What's
Mark.
that?
We can't see your
You
slides.
can't.
No. Did you press the green share screen button at the bottom?
I did. I'm talking away.
And then,
hold on a second.
And then pick the window that you want. If you press that, and then there should be options for windows.
I see like 7 windows.
Okay, so then just pick the one that's your presentation.
It is not up there.
I can share your slides.
Yeah,
if you
why
want.
don't you do that? If you've got the latest one, that would be great, because I'm not seeing
I do. Just tell me when to advance them.
Okay. It's funny, I see a lot of email. Oh, here we go. All right. And go ahead from the beginning if you would, Allison. There we go. So I already babbled quite a bit about some of the birds that we focus on, golden-winged warblers, American woodcock, some other riparian species that you'll find, common yellowthroat over there on the right. Eastern towhees will use that old shrub habitat that we find. Things like alder flycatchers are another species that you often find in those riparian zones. And in some areas in the southern Champlain Valley, you might even come across a species, the prairie warbler, which likes that same type of community, shrub habitat community. Go ahead, next, Allison. And this is an awesome picture of the habitat that we look to promote when we're doing shrubland bird conservation. You can see here, this is a mix of saplings and shrubs, open spaces, sometimes occupied by spirea and goldenrod. But this is the habitat that those species enjoy and will use during the breeding season to nest in. And in many cases, it's a habitat that you often find along a riparian system. And so we have started to work at looking at how we might combine those two components. Audubon in the past has been working primarily on the upland component, removing invasive species and retaining native shrubs in order to promote this habitat. But over the past year or so, we've started to look at that connectivity with those riparian settings and see how we might combine those efforts. Okay, next. So one of the projects, and the project that I want to highlight here today, is work that we did with the Fish and Wildlife at the Lewis Creek Stream Bank Wildlife Management Area, which kind of straddles the border. It's a multi-parcel wildlife management area that straddles Moncton and Heinsberg. And the area in the red box is the area that we focused our efforts on. We were able to do this using habitat stamp money. So when you go out and buy your license plate, your conservation license plate, don't forget to also get your habitat stamp. It's a great program that has supported a lot of habitat work here in the state. This particular area that we worked on, the portion to the west, we did some invasive species removal on the upland component. And we primarily did that to support the native nannyberry and dogwood that was already there along the stream bank. And then we did our riparian plantings and our riparian work on that little tongue there along Lewis Creek that's on the east side of Silver Street. Go ahead, next one, Allison. And here you can see that that area that we worked on here, that eastern portion of this parcel. And surrounding that area, you'll see these plots in fuchsia. I hope I got that color right. And these are areas that we have identified as golden winged warbler habitat using a GIS modeling that was developed by Stephen Lamond. And this is a GIS layer that we often use when we look to identify properties that we can work on and potentially increase habitat for golden winged warblers and the other species that I showed there in the first slide, which often accompany, especially American woodcock. You can see that there's plenty of golden winged habitat in the area around our project site. And indeed, on the western portion of the parcel that we worked on, we did find a golden winged warbler that was using that shrub habitat there. So our goal was not only to enhance the riparian habitat along the edge of Lewis Creek here, but also to increase that habitat and make that habitat available for golden winged warblers. Next one, please. So this is our riparian planting area on that parcel. And all those little white dots that you see in there are not plants. They are where round bales were left over for an extended period of time and left little marks in the field. This was an actively hayed ag field. It was pastured as well. I went out there once and found some cows. And that area here that we have, that you can see, is the area that we were looking to do our planting. Interestingly enough, in September, after we did all of our work, Sean Regaldo, Regaldo, stick with that. I think I mispronounced it. He's an environmental analyst in Ethan Swift's shop. I'd like to be able to pull that up, but I don't think I'm going to be able to with the slides. But he came up with a riparian gap analysis using GIS and identified this stretch of the Lewis Creek as an area that was in need of attention. So it was nice to have that information after we move forward with our work here. We can check off a little bit of that riparian gap, which hopefully in the coming years will be filled with some nice vegetation. Go ahead, next. So our approach to the work that we were doing, a lot of this habitat that we look to promote, as I mentioned, is kind of a copse or cluster approach where you've got dogwoods or other viburnums in these pockets surrounded by goldenrod. You might have a few woody stems that are growing in the central area of that, saplings. These are areas where birds will sing from and singing perches. Birds like golden wings and towhees and things like that will use the dogwoods as a means of for areas for breeding and for creating nests. So we wanted to simulate that. And we did that by creating these small planting plots. And in each one of these planting plots was 2 to 3 woody stems that we planted, surrounded by dogwood, primarily gray stem, although there was some red osier and an occasional viburnum in there. The planting was done by the Intervale Conservation Nursery. They were great. They came right out. I had no trouble putting in the plants, but had never erected the deer fencing, which was the outer perimeter of each plot. Our thoughts there was with each one of these little copses that we were creating, we were going to concentrate the planting, and in doing so, hopefully reduce the amount of deer browse that may be focused on the new plants. So here's an example of one of these plots. It's small enough that the deer can't actually get in. And the idea is basically that the shrubs will grow along with the saplings, and they'll provide intermediate structure as the saplings get to be larger trees over time. And this intermediate structure is going to be perfect for a variety of different bird species. We identified each one of these plots and we marked them so that we could follow them over time to see how they did as far as deer browse. We did have one control that we kept open, and we didn't surround with deer fence. And the other idea with this was that, we're looking at creating a multi-stem approach by creating these copses. And in the interim, these little plots also in any kind of high water event will trap debris and create some slowing of water until these copses actually get established. Each one of these plots had about 10 shrub plants along with the saplings, and we maintained them over the course of the summer. We didn't have any problems with deer, but we did have problems with vegetation growing up and competing with the plants that we planted. So I had to crawl in each one of these things in late July to actually cut out all of the competing vines and grasses that were there. It will be interesting, and I think later on today, Annalise is going to talk about some pre-treatment possibilities, whether or not we could have pre-treated this to remove the competition prior to the planting. That might be something that we consider in future plantings. Go ahead, Allison, next. So here again is that bend in the Lewis Creek, and you can see this is a rough estimate of where our 10 plots were located, all along that southern riparian zone. And then the green plot that you see further to the north was a planting of cottonwoods, which didn't do all that well due to the dry weather. And then we also planted some chokecherry down there in the corner, which we didn't enclose in deer fencing because we had been, chokecherry, it seems, or from what I've heard, is not necessarily a primary browse species for deer. And we monitored these over the course of the summer. We didn't find any real deer browse. Again, the competition from other species was kind of the major concern that we had. But we did have a roughly 80% survivorship through the summer, and we'll be going back and taking a look at how those plants did in spring when snow melt goes off, and just keep monitoring them over time. But hopefully this riparian approach is something that will create habitat for birds as well as create a riparian buffer as those shrubs begin to send out stolons, hopefully create that nice dome-shaped old field shrub habitat that you see, and provide some protection for the central tree saplings that are growing. So over time, this may become a forested riparian zone, but in the interim, it'll be a shrub zone that works nicely for, again, these priority species that we're working with. Go ahead, Allison. So the exciting part about this is, again, we did this planting and the invasive control back in 2020. And now we found out through the state that the farmer that used to lease this property in order to hay it is no longer going to be doing that. So we're looking to expand our work and to broaden that approach and begin to do some plantings in that slightly light green area you'll see there. This field, the northern portion is primarily upland and gains some elevation, but this lower portion drops down into more of a floodplain kind of system. So we're hopefully in 2021 and 2022 going to be doing some plantings within this shaded area to expand that riparian zone and not only increase this habitat for shrubland birds. Again, you can see those fuchsia colored blobs there on the side that are good golden winged warbler habitat. So hopefully, as these plants and the shrubs regenerate out in this old field, will create that same habitat, and that area will pop up as in that fuchsia color as well. So we're hoping that this will be funded through the Habitat Stamp program. The state is now looking and reviewing different projects, and we're hoping to maybe get some plants in the ground, potentially using the same copse planting, but now knowing that we didn't have much deer browse there, we may approach this in a much different way. We may still concentrate our plantings and plant our saplings surrounded by dogwoods, but may not need the extra expense of putting up and the time to put up the deer fencing around that. So something to think about as we move forward, but hopefully this will be a great shrub old field habitat that will provide a nice riparian break along the Lewis Creek, as well as create great habitat for golden winged warblers, woodcock. The area there to the north, which is gonna, I think, be maintained as an open area, will be great for displaying woodcock. And then they'll use that shrub habitat for feeding and for nesting. And so a project that really, you know, combines all of the different components, GIS, both Sean's work with riparian systems that needed attention, our work identifying this property as a potential golden winged warbler site, and again, creating that buffer that Lewis Creek's needs right, you know, on this particular location. And then my final slide. I don't know how I'm doing with time. This is another bird which takes advantage of that habitat, a very close cousin of the golden winged warbler. This is a blue-winged warbler, and this is a bird that I caught with a Laird diamond over on another property that we're doing work and received Habitat Stamp fundings, which is Nordic Farms. This is an area in Charlotte that we're doing both invasive species control, doing grinding on some of the upland components, and we'll be again doing some plantings along one of the small drainages that runs through the farm this coming spring with Habitat Stamp money, and also money that we received or that the Land Trust received, the Vermont Land Trust, through a Cornell Small Grants program. So a number of these projects going around the Champlain Valley, and you know, I'm really excited to begin looking at this riparian component and add it to what we're already doing in the upland systems. I think that's it. And how do I do for time?
I think we're good, but I'm not sure that we have much time for questions.
Okay.
It looks like we have one question. I think we can answer that one, and then we'll move on to Will. So the question is, Mark, the Lewis stream bank planting is on private land. Is it open to visitors? Is there any signage?
So right now, because it's the Lewis Creek Stream Bank Wildlife Management Area is public land. It's owned by Fish and Wildlife. And at this point, you know, because it's a wildlife management area, you can access it. It is south of Heinsberg on Silver Street. If folks know that area, there's a big dip in the road, and there's a pull off on the eastern side of the road, and that's a place that you can park and access that field and head down to where we did the plantings and are doing the work. So this is an example of work that we're doing on public lands. The Nordic Farm work we're doing is a private piece, as well as, for instance, at Japrague's Park. So lots of opportunities on both public and private lands to do bird conservation that ties in with riparian work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. It looks like Mandy has a question for you in the chat that maybe you can answer in the chat. And yeah, really appreciate your presentation on birds.
Yeah, and thank you. I'm glad we sent that back up. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but
yeah, you never know what's going to happen. It can be be useful.
All right, thanks, Allison. Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely, thanks, Mark. Okay, and last up we have Will Eldridge of Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and he's going to talk about brook trout. Take it away, Will.
Great, thanks, Allison. And I want to thank Kylie and Mark for setting me up. I really appreciate you guys, everything you've done to talk about riparian areas, but also promoting the watershed grants program and the habitat stamp. Those are great. Both, you know, that you're demonstrating exactly what those programs are intended to be used for. So thank you very much. And also Mark highlighting the value of our state lands for this kind of riparian kind of, I see it as an experiment. You know, that's something else I think is important to highlight is, you know, we do, because these lands are, you know, some extent protected, you know, that is another value that I think they offer. So yeah, thank you very much for highlighting that, and, you know, really look forward to learning more about what you're seeing there around Lewis Creek. But I'm going to switch gears and start talking about brook trout. So it's native, it's the state fish of Vermont, and just want to give you a little bit of background first about the Department of Fish and Wildlife and kind of my role and how we kind of manage brook trout in the state. So as you know, I'm an aquatic habitat biologist, and so I actually don't handle a whole lot of fish. I deal specifically with the habitat side of things. So riparian areas and culverts, you know, fish passage, aquatic organism passage, things like that. We have a fish biologists who are the ones on the ground actually doing the management, you know, kind of setting harvest regulations and things like that. Also collecting a lot of the biological data on abundance and distribution and stuff like that. And so I just want to make sure I highlight those guys and women, you know, and the important work that, you know, we do as a department to manage these species. And so yeah, this isn't just me. So, but today I want to talk about this fish grow on trees and kind of explain what that means. And so communicating the importance of forested riparian areas for brook trout. Let's see, how do I advance? All right, so in Vermont, there we have 3 species of trout that live in streams and rivers. We have brook trout, which is the native species. It can be identified. It has light spots on a dark background. We also have brown trout, which was introduced from Europe in the 1800s. It has dark spots on a light background. Often you'll see them with red spots. And then there's also rainbow trout, which has dark spots on it. We have different trout species found in lakes. There's or salmonids, there's Atlantic salmon, as well as lake trout, also in Vermont. But just focusing on streams and rivers, generally what you'll run into are these 3 species. And if you look at, we did an angler survey in 2020, so last year, and we asked folks what their most preferred species is to fish for, and brook trout is the #1 species by resident anglers. So a very popular sport fish, you know, very important, you know, it's an iconic species in Vermont, but also an important species for anglers. And what do brook trout look like? And here's some glamour photos of brook trout. They, you know, they're incredibly diverse in their habitats, their size, life histories, all kinds of things. And so you can really get some monster brook trout. Generally, these are in lakes and ponds. You know, individuals over 5-10 pounds is possible. But in Vermont, you're more likely to run into the ones that over on the right-hand side of the screen. You know, more on like 4 to 6 inch range on our smaller streams and rivers. And these are all capable of reproduction. These could all be adults. So even those littler guys that, you know, can fit in one hand, those can be mature individuals. So you'll often find like those are some of the biggest individuals in some of our streams and rivers. We don't have them in Vermont, obviously, but there's other populations which actually migrate between fresh and salt water. These are referred to as coaster trout. And so they used to exist down in Long Island. That's not a life history form that we have here, but we do have both the lake and the stream form. The lake form is one that we don't have as many of. A lot of those populations have actually declined due to a combination of habitat issues as well as introduced species. So most of what we have in Vermont are these stream and river fish, the smaller ones on the right. And so what's the habitat that brook trout need? You know, I look at it as cold. So brook trout really don't like water temperatures above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Clean, so that refers to both water quality, so clean water, as well as the gravel, the substrate. Complex, so this means a mix of pools and riffles, so deep water, you know, shallow water, you know, that mix of gravels and things like that. You know, sometimes they'll use like cover for hiding or for feeding. You know, they use the gravel for spawning. They actually reproduce by laying eggs in the gravel, and then connected. So this is a picture of a culvert in the lower left here that's been replaced to provide aquatic organism passage. So you know, culverts when they're perched, they can be a barrier to fish passage, and which is important. You know, it's important for brook trout in particular to be able to get upstream to those colder headwater streams when streams warm up. And so having this connected habitat is really important. So the range of brook trout in the eastern U.S., they actually can be found as far south as Georgia, and you know, up to Maine, and then they extend into Canada as well. There's also native populations all the way over to Minnesota. But just focusing on the eastern U.S., it's really they're most along this Appalachian mountain spine, you know, between Georgia and Maine. If you look at the status of brook trout throughout that range on the East Coast, the red are the reduced, so these are populations at risk of going extinct. And so in the southern portion of the range, they're really not doing well. But when you get closer to Vermont, we're actually have a number of healthy populations here, a lot of healthy habitats here. So Vermont is one of their strongholds. It's a place that we'd like to, you know, we're very fortunate to have, you know, abundant brook trout populations. But you can see, like, there's a lot of brook trout throughout the rest of the range aren't doing well. So there's a risk of you know, that could happen in Vermont. So really maintaining healthy brook trout populations in Vermont is important to maintain this species on the East Coast. And so looking at their status in Vermont, like I said, you know, fish biologists have been studying this species for decades. And so we did a study back in the 1950s looking at their distribution. And so there's two maps of Vermont showing these subwatersheds. And what we found, you know, comparing their distribution in the 1950s with the 2000s, they're basically in the same places that they were historically. So we're finding that even over this 50, 60-year period, we haven't really seen a change in their brook trout distribution, you know, suggesting that they're holding steady here in Vermont. When we look at their, shifting over to the bar chart, looking at their abundance, we actually see that, you know, comparing the 1950s with the 2000s, that their abundance overall is actually increased from the 1950s, mostly due to an increase in what we call YOY, which is young of the year. So that's the babies, the juveniles, you know, in their first year of life. And so, but again, pointing to this idea that in Vermont, brook trout are really holding on. You know, they're doing okay over this you know, 50, 60-year period. We haven't seen a decline, at least, which is, you know, not the case elsewhere in their distribution. But, you know, that's not to say that brook trout aren't threatened with a number of concerns, you know, threatened here in Vermont. And so here are some of the things that we worry about. You know, temperatures. The first one, like I said, they're a cold water species. They really don't like temperatures above 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere in that range. And temperature is the most important limiting factor limiting the distribution of brook trout in Vermont. All right, so temperature first. And so here's some data that we have. This is not a riparian area, but the lines there are just showing the impact of a dam on stream temperature. This is a small 2-acre dam and a headwaters. And what we found is that just between upstream and downstream of that dam, the temperature increased to roughly 13 degrees Fahrenheit. And so these small headwater dams can significantly increase temperature and really and turn a stream from favorable to brook trout. This thing barely gets above 60 degrees upstream of the dam. So very favorable to brook trout to not able to sustain brook trout. So just over a really short distance. Another big threat is sediment. Like I said before, brook trout spawn by depositing eggs and embryos in the gravel where they incubate over the winter. And so if there's not loose gravel where water can flow through, the eggs can actually get suffocated. There's also the sediment can also irritate their gills, and there's just a problem for them. And so, there's things that we look at are like embeddedness. So there's the picture of a rock, and that area, that the bright area on the bottom of that rock is the area of embeddedness. So that sediment basically is burying that rock, over 50%. Sediment's also bad for macroinvertebrates. So here's a stonefly, something that trout eat. And so, streams with lots of sediment, we don't find that the basis of their food web, the food that they eat. So stoneflies are an indicator of good water quality. It's also important trout food. And like I said, yes, so spawning, so sediment can impact spawning. And then, as we all know, TMDL, phosphorus and nitrogen. Sediment's another important source of phosphorus and nitrogen. So, things that we can do to limit sediment are important not only for brook trout, but for other aspects of the water as well. Another big threat is physical habitat alteration. Here's some of the things that have happened in Vermont in the last couple of years. A lot of this was in response to major storm events. So this is pictures that were taken after Tropical Storm Irene. So the Gilead Brook in Bethel, Vermont, basically after the storm, they were mining gravel out of the river to use to rebuild the roads. But also a lot of people think that these channelized rivers, basically it just looks like a sluice or something like that. Those are better for floods because you're getting the water out of there. As we know, that may move water out of that section, but what ends up happening is you're just transferring those problems downstream. It's also not good for trout. So a stream like this Bethel Gilead, you're not going to find trout in it. There's none of that habitat complexity similarly, we're seeing wood removal, also going in and re-engineering streams. Again, this is not good trout habitat. This is uniform. There's no complexity. There's nowhere for them to hide. Obviously, it's all exposed. There's no trees along the streams and rivers. So these are just some of the threats that we see facing brook trout. And so why do we need forested riparian areas? Well, trout grow on trees. And this is something I'm borrowing from a group called the Stroudwater Research Center in Pennsylvania. And full disclosure, I used to work there. And I kind of was involved in developing this. But anyway, trout grow, and it's also copyrighted, and I have permission to use it. That's why I use fish grow on trees rather than trout grow on trees. But anyway, so trout grow on trees. And so what does that mean? So the idea is that the fish eat the insects eat the leaves, and the leaves come from the trees. So you can actually draw a direct line between the fish and the trees, and literally without the trees, the fish wouldn't be able to wouldn't have anything to eat, is the idea. All right, and This is actually a program that the Stroudwater Research Center developed for schools, grades 4 through 12, to accompany the Trout in the Classroom program. But really, it can be used with any group. It doesn't have to be just school groups. I think you could use it on a tree planting with, you know, any time you're talking to the public. But you know, the idea is just communicating the importance of, you know, riparian areas to trout. And so one thing I really liked about this program is it has this thing called the bucket of benefits, just really appealing to me. I don't know, maybe I just like those kind of corny jokes, but it's what the benefits of riparian areas. And so the idea is you can actually just carry a bucket with you with these items in it that demonstrate, you know, that you can use to kind of like probe people, like, you know, here are the benefits of riparian areas. You know, like, what do you think toilet paper means? You know, for what kind of benefit is that riparian areas provide? Or this ice cube tray, and a sponge, fly swatter, things like that. And so I just want to give you some examples how I would use this. And so, you know, so the ice cube tray, bucket of benefits, you know, that's providing temperature moderation, right? And so, like I said, trout really need cold water, you know, or so the riparian areas, the trees provide shade, helps keep the water cool. We also see benefits in the wintertime to having that. What we're seeing in Vermont, there's also another risk of anchor ice, is what it's called. So ice that actually forms on the bottom of streams. And this is something that we see more in open rivers. And it's also a temperature thing. So if streams don't like get an ice layer on top, you know, so like ice on the surface, which is when it, you know, would normally form, what happens is if you get a cold snap, ice will actually form on the bottom of the stream, and that ends up, you know, that's where the eggs are incubating, and you actually end up, you can actually end up losing eggs because of either they freeze or you get scour. And so these trees help insulate streams and kind of prevent that anchor ice from forming. But yeah, so temperature moderation. Another one is the fish hotels is what I'm calling them. So in-stream structure and cover. So, you know, like these large wood jams are often like chock full of fish. Like you ask any angler, you know, where are the fish in this river? If there's a wood jam in there, they're probably going to be in that location. So rebranding log jams or large woody debris as fish hotels. And we actually have some evidence to support this. This is stuff, data from some wood additions in Vermont, so collected by a fish biologist. And we see that brook trout biomass increased 150% after wood addition. So showing that these, not only I don't think they saw an increase in the abundance, but the size of fish in these structures. So the fish are able to achieve a larger size in these large wood structures. Fish hotels, if you will. And then another is the food, so organic inputs and retention. And like I said, you know, fish eat, either there's that direct connection between the leaves, or fish will also eat a lot of terrestrial insects like ants and things that fall in. It's called arthropod rain. And so there's actually this idea that terrestrial subsidy, so basically streams and rivers, you know, if they're low productivity, if there's just not a lot of bugs in the river, fish will actually switch their diets to eating more terrestrial insects, and you get more terrestrial insects in streams and rivers that have trees on them. It's just, you know, there's just, I guess, easier for bugs to fall in. And so there's particularly on you know, less productive streams, having these riparian areas is important just to maintain productivity of the fish. Also, you know, the leaves can also stimulate the food web as being a food source. There's, you know, shredders and things that actually eat those leaves. And then the other benefit is water quality. And so this is a study from those same folks out at the Stroud Center. back in 2014. They reviewed a bunch of studies looking at the width of riparian buffers. And what they found is that nitrate removal increases with buffer width. And they're able to show this linear relation, or curvilinear relationship. Similarly, sediment removal increases with buffer width. And actually one of the recommendations out of this study was a 100-foot buffer was the appropriate, was the optimal size to kind of achieve these benefits without compromising other land uses, agriculture practices, things like that. So they were recommending a 100-foot minimum buffer. And so in Vermont, what do we recommend for riparian zone? So jump to the end there, 100-foot. But looking at the big picture here, our desired condition in the riparian zone is this natural community. So natural vegetation, the species appropriate for that site, complexity, different ages, different, some natural regeneration. Really what what we like, what would be desirable is a self-sustaining riparian area with the natural community that doesn't require any management, maybe invasive treatment, but no other management once it's established. And that's our desired condition. We're really about restoring natural processes. So not just having the trees there, but also having the process of trees being able to reestablish themselves. And kind of restoring those natural, not just the structure and the functions, but the processes that maintain those. Really, it's about being able to to let the river manage itself, self-heal and take care of itself. All right, and so yeah, tree planting is a way to get there, but it's going to take a while. And that's all I've got. So yeah, I'll take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Will. Yeah, we're a few minutes over time, but we don't have anything next. So if folks want to stick around and have any questions for Will or for any of the other presenters, we have the room.
Cool.
Well, I don't see or hear any questions.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Will, and thanks to Mark and Kylie as well for taking some time to talk about managing riparian areas for different species. This is a really interesting session. I really appreciate your sharing everything that you guys know. And as I said yesterday, for folks who are on the call, we do have this room all day. So between now and when our next session is, which I think is at 11, so for the next half hour, we've got some time for people to hang out. Oh, it looks like there is a question from Carissa for all three of the presenters. Oh, they want to know if you do this presentation to the general public.
All three of us together? I mean, all three presentations?
I would assume.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the timing and everything like that, but and where you're asking us to potentially do the presentation. But yeah, anything to promote birds, fish, turtles, and riparian buffers.
Yeah, I'm always happy to present as well. Normally that'd be a big part of my year-to-year operations, but things were obviously scaled back last year. But yeah, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to do that.
This is outside of my, thank you all. This is outside of my NRCS hat. So I'm asking specifically if Conservation Commission's got the general public together, if you would do an online presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, we've been working, with the Nordic piece. We've been working with local area land trusts, and a lot of the work that we've been doing here at